The war had dragged on for years, and the Galactic Alliance was crumbling under the relentless advance of the Zytrax Empire. Once heralded as an unshakable union of diverse species, the Alliance now resembled a desperate coalition clinging to survival. Smoke billowed from shattered warships above the dying skies of Velith Prime, the latest world to fall. On the bridge of the Asternia, Admiral Kevrick, a hulking Nerillian with deep purple skin and golden eyes dulled by exhaustion, stood silent as reports filtered in from the battlefield. "Admiral, the Eastern Quadrant has collapsed. Reinforcements aren't coming," said an Aurelian tactician, her insectoid mandibles clicking with restrained panic. Kevrick closed his eyes, his broad shoulders sagging under the weight of another defeat. The Zytrax were unlike any foe the Alliance had ever encountered. Their war machines were more advanced, their tactics more ruthless, and their soldiers utterly unyielding. The Alliance, with its patchwork fleets and fractured strategies, was outmatched at every turn. "It's over, isn't it?" whispered a young lieutenant beside him, his voice breaking. "They'll take the capital next, and after that—" "Not yet," Kevrick interrupted, his voice sharp despite his fatigue. "We still have cards to play." But even as he said it, doubt crept in. He had served the Alliance for decades, and never had he seen such despair. A part of him wondered if they were simply delaying the inevitable. Hours later, in the hallowed chambers of the Alliance High Council, the air was thick with tension. Representatives from the remaining member species sat in grim silence around the circular table, their expressions a mixture of fear and resignation. At the center of the room, a holographic display projected the cold, unforgiving statistics. Fleets destroyed, planets lost, lives extinguished. "We cannot win this war," declared Minister Vrel, a thin, sharp-featured Thalathian whose voice carried the weight of collective defeat. "Every simulation shows the same result. The Zytrax will reach Elisar within weeks. Once the capital falls, the Alliance is finished." A murmur rippled through the chamber. The council members knew he was right. They had tried every conventional strategy, every calculated risk, and still the Zytrax advanced. They were predators, and the Alliance had become their prey. "I refuse to accept that," said a voice, cutting through the despair like a blade. All eyes turned to the human representative, Commander Ruth Vargas. She stood tall and unyielding, her sharp features framed by short-cropped dark hair. Her uniform was pristine, but the fire in her hazel eyes spoke of someone who had seen countless battles and refused to back down. "Humans always refuse to accept reality," muttered a Gorak delegate, his deep-set eyes narrowing. Ruth ignored the comment. "With all due respect, Minister Vrel, your simulations are meaningless because they don't account for one critical factor: us. You've kept humanity on the sidelines because you think we're too unpredictable, too aggressive. Well, look where your calculated restraint has gotten us." She gestured at the holographic map, where red markers of Zytrax control spread like a bloodstain. "You're out of time and out of options. Let us fight." "You propose we hand the reins of the Alliance's remaining fleet to humans?" scoffed Vrel. "Your species has no experience in interstellar warfare of this scale. Your methods are effective," Ruth interrupted, her tone razor-sharp. "You've all heard the stories. Humanity's wars on Earth were brutal, yes, but we survived every single one. We've mastered the art of adaptation, of turning weakness into strength. You want to win? Then let us do what we do best." The chamber erupted into heated debate. Some counselors argued passionately in favor of giving humanity a chance, citing their unique history of resilience and ingenuity. Others balked at the idea, fearing that unleashing humanity's infamous ruthlessness would make them no better than the Zytrax. As the arguments raged, Ruth stood silently, her gaze fixed on Kevrick. The Admiral, who had remained uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. His voice carried the weight of authority and exhaustion. "Commander Vargas," he said, his golden eyes locking onto hers, "if we grant your request, there will be no turning back. No limits to what you may do. Can you bear the burden of such responsibility?" Ruth met his gaze without hesitation. "I've borne it before, Admiral, and I will again." The only question is whether you're willing to let us save you. The chamber fell silent. One by one, the counselors turned to Vrel, who stared at Ruth as if weighing the fate of the galaxy in his slender hands. Finally, with a reluctant nod, he spoke. "Very well," he said. "The humans will lead." By the time Ruth returned to the fleet's command center, her mind was already racing with plans. The Zytrax fought with overwhelming power and precision, but power wasn't everything. Wars were won with ingenuity, with audacity, with the willingness to take risks others wouldn't dare. And humans were nothing if not daring. She called an emergency meeting of the remaining fleet's captains, a motley collection of aliens who regarded her with varying degrees of skepticism and outright distrust. Ruth wasted no time on pleasantries. "We're not here to play defense anymore," she said, her voice cutting through the room like a battle cry. "The Zytrax think we're beaten, that we'll keep retreating until there's nothing left to retreat to. They're wrong. We're going to hit them where it hurts, and we're going to make them regret ever crossing us." One of the captains, a hulking Vornak with jagged scales and a deep voice, growled, "And what makes you think your species can do what the rest of us couldn't?" "Because we've been underestimated before," Ruth said simply. "And every time, we've turned it into our greatest weapon." For a moment, silence reigned. Then, slowly, the captains began to nod. Skepticism lingered in their eyes, but so did a glimmer of hope. Ruth knew it would take more than words to earn their trust, but for now, it was enough. As she left the meeting, Ruth paused to gaze out at the vast expanse of space beyond the station's viewport. The stars seemed colder, more distant than ever. But somewhere out there, the Zytrax were waiting, confident in their impending victory. Ruth clenched her fists. "Let them think they've won," she murmured. "They don't know what's coming." The first battle under human command began with silence, not the deafening roar of engines or the clash of weaponry. Ruth Vargas stood in the dimly lit command center, her eyes fixed on the holographic display of the battlefield. The Zytrax fleet loomed ahead, their massive warships arranged in a perfect formation, a wall of destruction advancing methodically toward a distant Alliance outpost. Their confidence was evident in their movements. They had seen this dance before, and it always ended the same way, the systematic obliteration of their enemies. "Are we ready?" Ruth asked, her voice calm but steely. The technician beside her, a wiry Relian with translucent skin that shimmered under the light, nodded. "The decoy units are in position, Commander. The fleet awaits your orders." Ruth's gaze didn't waver. The Alliance captains had followed her instructions, albeit with varying degrees of reluctance. They were used to defensive maneuvers, to fighting with honor and restraint. What Ruth had proposed was something entirely different: misdirection, sabotage, and the calculated use of chaos. "Good," she said. "Begin." Across the battlefield, Alliance frigates powered up, their engines flaring to life as they darted toward the Zytrax lines. They moved erratically, their formations scattered, their patterns nonsensical. It was a deliberate act, meant to draw the Zytrax into overextending their forces. Predictably, the enemy responded. Ruth watched as the Zytrax commander, visible as a tiny, sharp-edged figure on the display, issued orders. The alien fleet shifted, splitting into two groups to encircle the apparent stragglers. "They're taking the bait," said Captain Melek, a dour-faced Morivan whose deep-set eyes rarely betrayed emotion. He stood with his arms crossed, his distrust of Ruth palpable but contained. "But this won't hold them for long. They'll adapt." "They always adapt," Ruth replied. "So we'll stay one step ahead." As the Zytrax pursued the decoy ships, Ruth's real plan unfolded. A strike team of human-piloted stealth bombers, hidden within the shadow of a nearby asteroid field, slipped past the enemy's perimeter. Their target wasn't the Zytrax warships, but their supply vessels, bulky, unguarded hulks carrying munitions and fuel. The bombers struck with precision, detonating the transports in a series of fiery explosions that lit up the darkness of space. The Zytrax fleet faltered. Their perfect formation began to fracture as ships diverted to assess the sudden attack. Ruth seized the moment. "Signal the main fleet," she ordered. "Engage now." Alliance battleships surged forward, their weapons blazing. The captains, emboldened by Ruth's boldness, executed her orders with precision. The battlefield erupted into chaos, the calculated kind that Ruth had planned for. The Zytrax, so accustomed to disciplined warfare, struggled to adapt. Their strength lay in overwhelming power, not improvisation. Despite the apparent success, the cost was high. Ruth watched grimly as Alliance ships fell, their hulls pierced by the Zytrax's relentless firepower. Each loss felt like a weight pressing on her chest, but she pushed the emotion aside. She had no time for grief. Not yet. In the midst of the carnage, a message came through. The face of Admiral Kevrick appeared on the screen, his expression equal parts awe and discomfort. "Your tactics are effective, Commander Vargas," he said. "But this level of aggression, it's necessary." Ruth cut in, her tone brooking no argument. "If we hesitate, if we falter, they'll destroy us. This is war, Admiral. We can't afford to fight by their rules." Kevrick didn't respond immediately. His golden eyes flicked to the display, where the Zytrax fleet was beginning to retreat. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "Do what you must." As the battle drew to a close, Ruth felt the faint stirrings of hope among her crew. The Zytrax had been dealt a blow, not decisive, but enough to remind them that the alliance wasn't finished. Ruth, however, wasn't satisfied. A single victory wouldn't win the war. They needed to keep pressing, to keep the enemy off balance. In the days that followed, Ruth's strategies became the cornerstone of the alliance's renewed offensive. She pushed her forces hard, using every resource and every advantage at their disposal. Her tactics were unorthodox, even brutal. She deployed decoy fleets to lure the Zytrax into traps, mine critical supply routes, and used psychological warfare to sow confusion among the enemy ranks. Not everyone approved. During one strategy meeting, Captain Melek spoke up, his voice sharp with disapproval. "You're turning us into them," he said. "What's the point of winning if we lose our humanity in the process?" Ruth fixed him with a cold stare. "The point, Captain, is survival. You can't moralize when the alternative is extinction. If that makes us monsters, so be it. Better monsters than martyrs." Melek said nothing more, but the tension in the room was palpable. Ruth knew that many of the captains shared his unease. She didn't blame them. She had seen the cost of her choices, the scorched battlefields, the collateral damage, the haunted expressions of her crew. But she also knew that hesitation would cost them far more. The turning point came during the Battle of Arithos, where the Alliance forces, led by Ruth, launched a daring assault on a heavily fortified Zytrax outpost. The plan was risky, relying on precise timing and coordination. Ruth knew that if even one element failed, the entire operation could collapse. As the battle raged, Ruth's flagship, the Resolute, took heavy fire. Sparks flew as the bridge shook, and alarms blared incessantly. Despite the chaos, Ruth remained focused. She barked orders with unwavering confidence, her presence a steady anchor for the crew. When the dust settled, the outpost lay in ruins, and the Zytrax fleet was in full retreat. It was a decisive victory, one that shifted the momentum of the war. The Alliance had proven that they could not only resist the Zytrax, but also strike back with devastating force. As the fleet regrouped, Ruth stood in the observation deck, staring out at the vast expanse of space. Kevrick joined her, his expression unreadable. "You've given us a fighting chance," he said. "But at what cost?" Ruth didn't look at him. Her gaze remained fixed on the distant stars. "The cost doesn't matter," she said quietly. "Not if we win." Kevrick said nothing, but the weight of her words lingered in the air. Ruth knew that the road ahead would only grow darker. But she also knew that she couldn't stop now. There was too much at stake. The war wasn't over. Not yet. The final assault on the Zytrax homeworld began under the shadow of a dying star. Ruth Vargas stood on the bridge of the Resolute, her gaze fixed on the crimson orb at the center of the system. The light it cast bathed everything in an eerie glow, as though the cosmos itself bore witness to the bloodshed to come. Around her, the Alliance fleet, now a battle-hardened force forged by desperation and human ingenuity, prepared for the most dangerous operation of the war. This was it, the endgame. There would be no retreat, no second chances. "Commander, all units are in position," said Lieutenant Arian, a young Drellian whose voice trembled despite his best efforts to sound composed. "Good," Ruth replied. Her tone was calm, almost detached. "Relay the signal. Begin the operation." As Arian relayed her orders, the fleet moved into action. Alliance ships surged forward in coordinated waves, each unit executing its assigned role with precision. Human-led strike teams targeted the Zytrax's planetary defenses, disabling their orbital cannons and opening a path for the main fleet. The air crackled with tension as the first volleys of plasma fire lit up the void, illuminating the stark contrast between the Alliance's scrappy, patchwork vessels and the sleek, unyielding lines of the Zytrax warships. The Zytrax met them with ferocity, their ships pouring firepower into the advancing fleet. Explosions blossomed like deadly flowers in the darkness, Alliance vessels reduced to glowing debris in an instant. Ruth's jaw tightened as she watched the losses mount, but she forced herself to focus. Every ship destroyed, every life lost was a sacrifice to buy them an opening. She couldn't falter now. "Admiral Kevrick, bring your squadron to Sector 3, Ruth ordered. "We need to draw their main fleet away from the planet." Kevrick's voice came through the comms, steady despite the chaos. "Understood. Moving to engage." The Nerillian admiral had become one of Ruth's staunchest allies over the course of the war. Though they often clashed on strategy, he had come to respect her decisiveness and willingness to shoulder the burdens of command. Now, he executed her plan with unwavering precision, his fleet weaving through the Zytrax lines in a deadly dance. As the battle raged, Ruth's mind raced. She knew the Zytrax wouldn't break easily. Their resolve was as unyielding as the cold steel of their ships. That was why she had prepared a contingency plan, a final gambit to ensure victory, no matter the cost. "Commander Vargas," said Captain Melek, his voice cutting through the din of reports and alarms. "The fleet is holding, but we're sustaining heavy casualties. If this continues—" "It won't," Ruth interrupted. Her expression hardened. "Prepare the Omega Strike." Melek stiffened. "The Omega Strike? Commander, that weapon will—" "I know what it will do," Ruth said sharply. Her gaze met his unflinching. "And I also know it's the only way to end this. If we hesitate, they'll regroup, and everything we've fought for will be lost." Melek's jaw tightened, but he nodded. He didn't like it. None of them did, but he understood. Ruth had made it clear from the beginning. Victory was the only acceptable outcome. As the final preparations for the Omega Strike commenced, Ruth allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. She thought of Earth, of the blue skies and green fields she hadn't seen in years. She thought of the people she had lost, the sacrifices that had brought them to this point. She had always known that this war would demand everything of her, and she had given it willingly. But as the weight of her decisions settled over her, she couldn't help but wonder what it would mean for the future. The Omega Strike was humanity's most devastating weapon, a relic of their own turbulent history. It wasn't designed for precision or restraint. It was a blunt instrument of destruction, meant to annihilate anything in its path. Ruth had argued fiercely for its deployment, knowing it would tip the scales in their favor. But now, as the countdown began, she felt the enormity of what she was about to unleash. "Target locked," Arian reported, his voice barely above a whisper. Ruth took a deep breath. "Fire." The weapon discharged with a blinding flash. A pulse of energy, so intense it seemed to tear through the fabric of space itself. The Zytrax homeworld, once a shining jewel of advanced architecture and unyielding dominance, was engulfed in a cataclysmic wave of destruction. Ruth watched as the planet's surface fractured and burned, its defenses crumbling under the force of the strike. The Zytrax fleet, caught in the shockwave, broke apart like brittle glass. For a moment, there was silence, an unnatural stillness in the aftermath of the devastation. Then, slowly, cheers began to erupt across the comms. The Zytrax were retreating, their forces shattered, their will to fight extinguished. The war was over. But Ruth felt no elation, no relief. As she stood on the bridge of the Resolute, surrounded by the remnants of her fleet, she was acutely aware of the cost. Thousands of lives had been lost, countless worlds scarred by the conflict. And though the Alliance had won, it was a victory steeped in blood and ash. In the days that followed, the Alliance Council convened to discuss the aftermath. Ruth stood before them, her uniform pristine despite the weariness etched into her face. The counselors looked at her with a mixture of respect and unease, as though they weren't sure whether to hail her as a hero or fear her as a monster. "You've delivered us victory, Commander Vargas," Minister Vrel said, his tone carefully measured. "But the methods you employed, they will not be forgotten, nor should they be," Ruth replied, her voice firm. "I did what was necessary to ensure our survival. If you wanted a clean war, you should have fought someone else." The room fell silent. No one could argue with her logic, though many clearly wished they could. Ruth met their gazes, unflinching. She had no regrets, not about the choices she had made, not about the path she had taken. The galaxy was safe for now, and that was all that mattered. As the council session ended, Ruth stepped outside, the cool air of Elisar's capital a stark contrast to the heat of battle. She looked up at the sky, where the stars shone brightly, undisturbed by the violence that had unfolded beneath them. "You've won," a voice said behind her. She turned to see Kevrick, his golden eyes thoughtful. But at what cost? Ruth didn't answer immediately. She simply stared at the stars, their light distant and indifferent. Finally, she said, "The cost was everything. And it was worth it." Kevrick said nothing, and after a moment, he turned and walked away, leaving Ruth alone with her thoughts. She knew that history would judge her actions, that her name would be spoken with both reverence and fear. But as she stood beneath the endless expanse of the universe, she felt a quiet certainty. They had survived, and in the end, that was all that mattered.